I lost my grandma when I was 18. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who ran her own upholstery business for 5 decades and raised 3 kids. My mom, being the middle child, often clashed with her. When I was young, I would often see my grandma and my mom fighting for small things and would wonder why, until I realized that my grandma hated my mother because of me. For context, according to my aunt, my parents never really wanted me. They harbored resentment towards me from the moment I came into the world. For the initial 6 months of my life, I lived with her and my grandma. However, when I started growing up, my grandma forced my parents to buckle up and take responsibility. As a child, I remember I was subjected to numerous derogatory names by my parents, particularly from my dad, like Bimbo or Dumbo, if I made a slight mistake, which was really hurtful to hear. Interestingly, despite these labels, I happened to be the most academically inclined among my cousins. Thanks to my parents' encouragement from a young age, I've developed a passion for pursuing a science degree. My parents would beat me up for what seemed like trivial reasons, such as wearing nail polish or talking to a boy. My dad never let me wear makeup, disapproved of my tight clothes, even if it's just yoga pants with a long shirt, and basically anything associated with being a girl. Keep in mind that I was still growing, and his controlling nature affected me a lot. When my parents used to fight, it always seemed to somehow become my fault. On top of that, my mom consistently complained that I didn't contribute around the house. The reality was that I was taught from a very early age to help them out. I folded at least 2 loads of laundry every day, cleaned one of the bathrooms daily, handled the dishes, and took care of various other chores like sweeping the floors. Despite all this, I never uttered a complaint about it, but my parents never appreciated it. It felt like I was an unappreciated maid at their home. Back then, I used to do most of the things my parents told me to do and avoided anything they didn't mention. I refrained from drinking, stayed away from drugs, and made sure not to wear what they deemed exposing clothes. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to go out with friends, even for birthdays, and having them over was also off limits. There were times when I'd come up with excuses to stay later at school during the daytime because I enjoyed spending time with others outside the confines of my home. However, everything changed when my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even though I hated my dad for always trying to control my life, I still didn't want him to die, but my mom clearly didn't think this way. She left my dad, saying she did not want to be stuck with an ill husband. My dad and I were shocked when we watched her pack her bags and leave. Later, my dad broke down sitting on the porch. Even though I was just 14 years old, I could understand his pain. I had always seen him sit and drink a beer on the porch whenever he was having a bad day, so when I heard him crying, I got him a beer from the fridge. My dad started bawling when he noticed that I was handing him the beer, and he understood that I was trying to comfort him in the only way I knew. Since that day, I don't know how or why, but everything changed between me and my dad. He was not rude or abusive to me anymore. I can even venture to say that he was a good father after my mom left. In the following weeks, my parents got divorced, which was easy since my dad had a prenup with her and she could not take any alimony. By next month, my mom had already moved in with her new boyfriend, who was apparently her high school sweetheart, Morty. During this time, my mom hated having me for the weekends. Whenever my dad would drive me to drop me off, she would make up some excuses about why she could not see me that weekend. It really hurt me because it felt like my mom had divorced me along with my dad. Throughout all this, my grandma continued to visit me, and I loved spending time with her. She would call me and all my cousins once a month to have a sleepover at her house, which is still one of my favorite memories to date. 5 months after my parents' divorce, my mom got married again. Her high school sweetheart, Morty, bought a house for my mom in hopes that they could grow their family together. However, my mom had other plans. Whenever I would get to visit her, which was rare, I would always find my mom on her phone giggling and talking to someone with not a care in the world. She would only cut off the call once it was time for Morty to come back home. Apparently, Morty eventually found out that she had been cheating with another guy, and they had a huge fight. However, my mother managed to convince him that it was just a one-time mistake, so they stayed together. During this time, my dad's health was not improving from his cancer. In his last days, he would spend time with me as much as he could. I would come back home from school terrified, thinking something might have happened to him. Unfortunately, one night, my dad passed away in his sleep after months of chemo not working. My grandma and my dad's family were the first ones to reach me, as I just could not stop crying. When my mom came over, she was alone and there was no Morty in sight. I did not know this then, but my mom had continued to talk to the other guy behind Morty's back, and he had finally left. Throughout my dad's funeral, my mom kept saying how my dad's death could not have come at a worse timing since she was already dealing with a lot. Everyone was so shocked and irritated by her callousness. When dad's will was left, it was declared that all his assets would be going to me. Immediately, my mother seemed very interested to be back in my life. However, my grandma did not want me living with my mother since she knew the kind of daughter she had raised. She knew my mother wanted me for the money my dad had left behind for me. She and my aunt helped me sell all my dad's assets so they could open a college trust fund in my name. However, because I was still a minor, my mother's name also had to be added. Meanwhile, Morty, my mom's husband, divorced her during this period, and since they had no prenup, she ended up with a substantial settlement. That's why Grandma warned her not to dip into my funds, emphasizing that she already had her own money. My mom agreed to this arrangement. When Mom and I started living together, it felt at first like I was living with a stranger. She had changed so much over the years and not in a good way at all. All she ever did was behave like a teenager herself. She would get dressed up and go out every night. She would come back home late at night with strange men and take them into her bedroom. Every morning, I would walk into the kitchen and notice someone different. It became a daily routine. When I turned 16, my mom introduced me to her third husband, Joe. Right from the start, it was clear he didn't like me. His behavior towards me was mean and unnecessarily critical. Whenever I raised the issue with my mom, she confronted him, leading to even more covert and behind-the-back hostility. Then, when my brother arrived 10 months later, my mom's narrative shifted to paint Joe as a good person deep down and that apparently he struggled to express himself. I was encouraged not to resent him but to be more understanding. However, Joe has no issues showering love on my baby brother, Brad. Oddly, my mom confided in me several times that she had nothing in common with Joe but she had married him because he would provide us with a stable family. This was far from the truth because my mom and Joe would have nasty fights especially after Brad was born. Joe did not want my mother to spend any time with me and would yell at her if she was not anywhere near Brad. He would tell me things like how he wished I would have died with my dad or I lived with my grandma because he wanted his son to get all the love and attention. It was hurtful and mentally exhausting to live with them where I was clearly not wanted. Every time I would beg or question my mother about why she stayed with him, she would skillfully change the subject. One day my mother and Joe left us with my grandma so they could go out with their mutual friends and have a good time. This had initially started as once or twice a month but had moved on to them doing it almost every weekend. They would usually ask me to watch Brad while they were out but that night I was studying for my exam so they dropped us both off at grandma's. I loved spending time with her and she usually cooked really tasty dishes for me while I could study peacefully. Brad was playing with his toys on the living room floor. My grandma had strictly told my parents that they should be back by 11 o'clock to pick us up. However, even after 11 p.m. my parents had not come back. I was starting to get worried as I had my exams the next day and I also needed to put Brad to bed on time otherwise Joe would yell at me. Meanwhile, my grandma kept calling and left 3 angry messages for my parents. At 12 a.m., Joe and my mom finally showed up in their car completely blank out drunk and giggling like teenagers. They reeked of alcohol and we were shocked that they had even managed to drive here without getting caught. Joe went to pick up Brad while my mother asked me to gather my things so we could drive back. However, my grandma put her foot down. She yelled at them for showing up this late and also being so drunk which was dangerous for all of us. She told Joe that she could not let him take his son in this state and that we should call an Uber for us and leave the car at her place. However, Joe started fighting with my grandma telling her to mind her own business and how he was the father so he knew what was best for his son. Tensions escalated quickly, with heated exchanges of curses between my grandma and Joe. My mom stood by saying nothing clearly drunk out of her mind and unable to process things. I could feel the tension rising so I pleaded for them to stop, reminding them they were scaring my brother. But my words fell on deaf ears, the yelling persisted, and Joe started throwing insults at my grandma and me saying how he never liked us but tolerated us for the sake of my mother. This made my grandma more pissed and in a fit of frustration, she threatened to call the police. Hearing this, Joe, who was clearly drunk and yelling like a maniac, did the worst thing that I have ever seen anyone do. He slapped my grandma. I screamed in horror as Joe's hand connected with my grandma's face, the sound echoing through the room. Stop it. Just stop, I yelled but Joe did not even glance at me while Brad started to cry clearly traumatized. My grandma, holding her cheek, yelled for me to call the police as my mother watched in horror. I don't even remember what I told the 911 operator as I was crying too much. Fortunately, the person understood and stayed with me on call until the police arrived. When Joe noticed the approaching sirens, panic crossed his face. Suddenly he started to beg my grandma, pleading with desperation in his eyes. He begged her not to press charges, insisting it would ruin his life and my mom's life. In the end, Joe was charged with assault and taken away in handcuffs. He kept pleading with my mom to help bail him out but my mom, who had stood frozen earlier, started to cry and yell at him. My grandma made it clear to my mom that if she did not divorce that guy she would involve the CPS also and she would lose both her children. My mother simply nodded, clearly looking terrified. It was only later that I found out that Joe and my mom had also tried drugs that night along with alcohol. The reason she escaped not getting arrested that night is because she was mostly silent, unlike Joe. That night, I and Brad stayed at my grandma's place because I refused to be with her alone as I was so disappointed and traumatized. Thankfully, the next day, when my mother came to her senses she realized just what her husband had done. She filed for divorce and forbade him from ever seeing us. When the rest of the family found out about what Joe had done, they all came down on my mom, and rightfully so. Everyone had questions, and rightly so. Why did it take so long for my mom to take action? Why didn't she see the signs earlier? My aunt and uncle yelled at my mom until she started to cry. They were so pissed that they vowed to never speak to her ever again for what her husband had done. As per Joe's charges, since he was a first-time offender, the court imposed him with probation. During this period, Joe had to attend counseling and was ordered to stay away from us. He could only see his son if my mother allowed and she was present as well. He did try to beg my mother for forgiveness, but my mother didn't listen and divorced his manipulative ass. She got a lot from him in the settlement and has since been living a good life. I did not want to stay with my mom after the Joe incident, so I moved all my things to my grandma's place while Brad stayed with my mom. My mom didn't like this arrangement one bit since she depended on me to babysit my brother, but she could not say anything to me for fear that my grandma would chew her off. This year, I celebrated my 18th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult and start a new phase of my life. However, life had other plans for me. My grandma passed away just a week after my birthday. She had a heart attack and it was completely unexpected since she did not have any heart problem. After her funeral, the whole family was informed that she had drawn up a will to divide her assets. For my mom and aunt, she had equally divided up her family heirlooms and jewelry, which were quite expensive. For her oldest son, my uncle, she had left him her car, which he had always loved. For my cousins, she had divided her money to be put in for their college trust funds. For me, she had left her most important asset, her house. Apparently because I was the closest to my grandma among all and had been living with her, she did not want me to go back home to my mom ever again. I was shocked and started to cry tears of joy as her house meant a lot of happy memories for me. Unfortunately, my grandma didn't leave Brad with anything. I don't know if she simply forgot or maybe it was because Brad was just my half-brother. Needless to say, my mom was livid with my grandma's. She flat out said that giving me a house was worth so much more than her jewelry and it simply wasn't fair for her mother to leave me so much. No one else, except my mother, had any complaints since they all understood that my grandma had left us with things that we all deserved. My mother then got angry that Brad did not get anything and started to badmouth my grandma, saying how she was such a selfish woman for not doing anything for her son. I got pissed and told her that she should be grateful that her mother decided to leave her anything at all after what her ex-husband did to her. Hearing this, my mother got pissed, saying how I had no right to bring up the past, which just made me scoff at her. Then she started to tell me how I should sell grandma's place and move in with her. I told her that I genuinely loved staying at the house and would never sell it since it meant more to me than money. My mother did try to urge me more, but I stood my ground. I have to say that it has been wonderful living on my own. I have always been surrounded by toxic people until I moved to my grandma's place permanently, and I have also never lived alone. However, I have been spending a lot of time with myself and going to therapy to deal with my grandma's death. With everything going on in my life, I decided to take a gap year. However, because I am no more a minor, I wanted to remove my mother from my trust fund. I needed her signature to access the funds and also to remove her from the beneficiaries. So I went to talk to my mother 2 months ago. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robin, who she had been seeing for weeks. Robin seemed like a pleasant guy, however quite younger than her, unlike all her previous ex-husbands. However, I knew better than to bring his age up, so I asked my mom to talk privately and she agreed. I expected things to go smoothly with her regarding my trust fund, since this was rightfully the money that my dad had left for me. However, my mother started to freak out when she heard that I wanted to remove her from the trust. I found this odd and told her how this was always the plan anyway, and now that I am 18 I would like to handle my own finances. She refused and told me that I was still young, and because I was anyway not going to college this year, I didn't need to remove her. Her behavior was starting to make me suspicious, but my mother kept insisting that I could always come to her when I started college. Later, I spent some time with Brad and left. It was only when I was driving back home did I realize that there was a chance that my mother could have been using my money from the funds, even though it seemed far-fetched at that time. I decided to consult a lawyer who could help me figure out the terms and conditions of the trust document. The lawyer reviewed and agreed that my mother needed to sign off for me to access the funds, however I could view its current value if needed. This is how I found out from the bank what my mother had been doing. Not only had my mother been withdrawing money from the trust fund in small amounts over the years, but after our recent conversation, she had completely wiped the account clean. I was horrified. It felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath me. The betrayal hit hard, leaving me grappling with a sense of betrayal and disbelief. I felt so pissed about what my mother had done. For days, I was crying and moping around the house, unable to understand why my mother would do something like this. No wonder, she did not want me to remove her from having access to my funds. I knew if I confronted her about it, she would just deny it or come up with a lame excuse. I felt like I needed to teach her a lesson. Just as luck would have it, my mom, who was oblivious that I knew about her backstabbing, called to let me know that she was getting married yet again. She was excitedly talking about how Robin was definitely the one, which almost made me roll my eyes, as this was the same shit I had heard from her with every guy. She told me how she was going to have a grand wedding to celebrate her love with Robin. I just wanted to yell and scream at her for being such a trashy parent and stealing my money, but I kept my mouth shut as I wanted to take my revenge. Since she was having a wedding, it gave me the perfect opportunity to come up with a plan. I decided to have a family meeting so I could rally all my cousins and trusted relatives for what I was about to do. I told them everything and showed them documents about how my mother had been withdrawing money from my college trust fund that had all the money that my dad had left behind for me and how she had wiped it clean when she knew that she would have no more access to it. As I shared the extent of her betrayal, the family's shock and disbelief mirrored my own when I first learned the truth. I told them how the timing of her wedding seemed off and she had probably withdrawn so much for her lavish wedding and I wanted to humiliate her at this event before getting her arrested. My aunt and uncle were horrified that my mother could stoop so low and promised me that they would have my back. My cousins also agreed with my plan. My mother's wedding was last week. She had invited the entire family to her church wedding and grand reception with Robin. I decided to go to the wedding wearing a t-shirt that had the word "My mother's a gold digger" in bright red letters. I got this shirt custom made just for this occasion. Seeing my outfit, Robin and his family looked shocked while I just politely smiled and went to find my seat. My side of the family already knew about my plan, so they were ready. When my mother, oblivious to my plans, began her walk down the aisle, I remained seated. She did not even glance at me as she walked past, so my plan seemed to be working. During the ceremony, when the priest asked if anyone objected to the union of the couple, I knew this was my moment. I raised my hand in objection. The priest looked taken aback. However, along with me, my aunt, uncle and my cousins also raised their hands. My mother and Robin looked at us in horror as I rose from my seat. My mother finally realized the words on my t-shirt and her face turned red in embarrassment. In front of the assembled guests, I publicly accused my mother of stealing money from my college trust fund. Holding up documents, I exposed the details of her betrayal, emphasizing that she had stolen my hard-earned funds, leaving me without the means for college. Her face drained of color as whispers spread among the guests. I then asked her loudly why would she steal money from her own daughter when she had been married 3 times already and had received more than enough alimony in her previous 2 marriages. The room filled with gasps as Robin turned to my mother, clearly unaware of her actions. He asked her what I meant by 3 marriages when she had only told him about 1 marriage. My mother glared at me in anger and started to yell at me about how childish I was and that she had not stolen any of my money since she had every right to the money as she had been married to my father, and told me how I should be grateful to her that I was ever born. I yelled back at her that what she had done was illegal and that I was going to make sure she got arrested. However, my mom scoffed and told me how ungrateful I was, insisting it wasn't a big deal since she had practically raised me and the least I could do was let her have the money. She argued that, as my mother, she had every right to my money. That's when Robin chimed in. He asked my mother if this was why they had managed to afford such an extravagant wedding since my mother was footing the bill for everything. My mother kept quiet, which was basically her admitting to it. This is when all hell broke loose. I couldn't contain my anger and began yelling at her. The chaos escalated as my relatives joined in, expressing their outrage at my mom's despicable actions. Amidst the shouting, my mom retaliated, insisting it was a private matter between me and her and how they should not judge her for it. Things got physical when my aunt got too close while confronting her, leading to shoving between them. The chaos reached its peak, prompting someone to call the police. Eventually, my mom was arrested since she kept shouting and yelling when the police arrived and refused to settle down. I went to the police station with my aunt to give my statement. Since then, my mother has been charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I can't believe this even when I am writing it because I never thought I would get my mother arrested. I can't believe she would do such a thing to me. Since her wedding, I have been receiving calls from everyone both out of concern and also indignation. Some of my distant relatives do think that I took things too far and that I should have never involved others in this matter or got my mom arrested. My side of the family believes that I did the right thing. However, this is such an extraordinary circumstance that I am forced to ask if I did go too far with my mom. Ida? Update 1. Thank you everyone for your kind words. When I posted this, I was overthinking and I felt really guilty since I have never really hated my mom, or at least I didn't until she pulled this shit. I never wanted to file a case against her and it still feels like I'm having a bad dream. However, I do understand that this is all the consequences of her own actions. To everyone who is worried about me, please don't worry because my uncle has helped me find a good lawyer who is confident that we will win this legal suit against my mom. My only goal is to recover my lost money, or at least as much as I can. Also, for anyone wondering about Brad, he is doing okay. He is still too young to understand what is happening. He is currently staying with Joe and his family since my mom's arrest. Update 2. It's been 6 months since my last update. I know a lot of you have been wondering about what happened, and I would like to clarify that I was not allowed to talk or write anything about the case since the legal proceedings were going on. In short, the court ruled in favor of me. My mother has been asked to pay back every penny of the money that she had stolen from me. She cried and begged, but the judge didn't budge. She now has to liquidate all her assets and probably also sell her house in order to pay me. It feels so good to write this since these last few months have been brutal on my mental health. The only thing that has kept me going is thinking of my grandma and dad. My grandma would have been proud that I stood up to my mom, and my dad would have wanted me to have his money so I could invest in my future. Update 3. It's been 3 months since I last updated here. How was everyone's New Year's? Mine was fantastic. My mother, facing the weight of her actions, has repaid the entire amount she had embezzled from my college trust fund. The legal proceedings compelled her to make amends, at least financially. I also made the difficult decision to sever ties with my mother permanently. The rest of my family echoed this sentiment, and we collectively decided to distance ourselves from her despite her trying to reach out to us as if she expected us to just forgive and forget this incident. Lately, I have been checking out brochures and thinking about what's next in 2024. The gap year has turned out to be amazing overall despite the legal proceedings. It has been a mix of figuring myself out and healing myself from the past trauma. Spending time with my cousins and other family members has always been a big part of moving forward.